What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming.
The house waited. It had waited for centuries, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years, its windows like half-lidded eyes peering out over the overgrown fields. The paint had long since peeled to a dull gray, giving the place the look of a great, sleeping animal. Inside, the floorboards were bowed and uneven, the air thick with the smell of earth and the faint, metallic temps of something older, something not entirely natural. When Roger and Carolyn Perrin first pulled their station wagon up the long dirt drive, the January sun was struggling to break through a veil of pale clouds. The countryside seemed frozen in time, as though winter had cast a spell to preserve every branch and stone wall in a kind of silent stasis. "This is it?" Caroline had asked softly, as though afraid to speak too loudly. Roger smiled, proud of the deal he had found. 9 acres, a historic farmhouse, a fresh start. You can't beat it. The 5 Perrin daughters pressed their faces against the windows, their breath fogging the glass. To them, the house was a castle, a world to explore. Even the family's dogs seemed restless, their nails clicking nervously against the car's floor. The first step across the threshold felt like entering another world. The temperature dropped noticeably as they stepped inside, their breath puffing in the frigid air. The house was darker than it should have been, even with daylight streaming through the windows, as though the shadows were denser here, unwilling to yield. Yet, for all its eeriness, Caroline felt a strange pull, as though the house was not merely a structure but a presence that had noticed them, regarded them, and somehow accepted them. The farmhouse had stood since 1736, a witness to nearly 250 years of births, deaths, storms, and seasons. Families had come and gone, leaving behind pieces of themselves, letters hidden in walls, toys buried under floorboards, prayers whispered over sick beds, and tragedies. The land had seen more than its share of sorrow: drownings in the nearby creek, suicides in the barn, children who succumbed to fever. Some deaths were recorded, others merely rumored, but all seemed to cling to the place like smoke that refused to dissipate. It was said that one of the earliest owners, a woman named Bathsheba, had been accused of witchcraft after a neighbor's infant died mysteriously in her care. No court ever convicted her, but the whispers lingered long after her death. Local law claimed she hanged herself in the attic, cursing the land and anyone who would dare to live there. These were the stories that locals told in hushed voices, stories that the Perrins had not yet heard. That first night, the house settled around them like a living thing. The girls slept in their new rooms, exhausted from the move, while Roger and Caroline shared a bottle of cheap wine by the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches, but inside it was still too still. Around midnight, Caroline thought she heard a faint sound coming from the kitchen. At first, she assumed it was one of the girls out of bed, but when she went to investigate, the kitchen was empty. The broom she had left propped against the wall earlier was now lying in the center of the floor. She'd laughed softly at herself and returned it to its corner, telling herself it had simply fallen over. But when she came back in the morning, it was lying in the middle of the floor again. Over the next few days, the house began to reveal itself. Doors that had been closed at night were found open in the morning. The girls began to complain of small things: toys moving, faint voices calling their names, cold spots that left goosebumps on their arms. The dogs refused to come inside. They stayed on the porch, whining as though they sensed something the humans could not. One evening, as Caroline was folding laundry, she caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway. A figure, a woman perhaps, dressed in a gray dress. Caroline turned quickly, heart hammering, but the hole was empty. She did not tell Roger, not yet. It was Andrea, the eldest daughter, who first discovered the attic door. It was hidden behind a warped panel, difficult to open. Inside was a low, dusty space filled with broken furniture, old trunks, and the smell of dry wood. The air was thick, oppressive. Something about the place made her uneasy. She left quickly, but not before noticing strange markings carved into one of the beams, symbols she did not recognize, almost like runes. That night she dreamed of a woman standing in the attic, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes black and unblinking. When Andrea woke, the dream clung to her like cobwebs. By the end of the first month, the family could no longer ignore the sense that they were not alone. The activity grew bolder. Doors slammed by themselves. A putrid smell, like rotting flesh, would suddenly fill a room and vanish just as quickly. One evening, April came running into the living room, her face pale. "There's a boy in my room," she whispered. Roger searched the entire house but found nothing. April insisted that he had been sitting in the corner, watching her, his face sad. From that night on, April left small toys in the corner of her room, as though offering them to an unseen friend. Sometimes, she said, they would be gone in the morning. One morning, Caroline woke to find a deep bruise on her thigh, as though someone had grabbed her in the night. She told herself it must have been from bumping into something during the move. But as the days passed, more bruises appeared. She began to feel constantly fatigued, as though something were draining her strength. At night, she heard faint whispering, not words she could understand, just a sibilant murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One night, she woke to find a woman standing beside the bed. The figure was thin, her skin gray and withered, her head hanging at a terrible angle. Caroline could not move. The figure leaned closer until Caroline could smell the stench of decay on her breath. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. Caroline did not sleep again that night. The house had become a labyrinth of dread, its every creak and shadow charged with meaning. The children clung to one another, afraid to be alone. Roger, practical and stubborn, tried to dismiss it all as imagination, drafts, and an old house settling. But deep down, he too felt it, that presence, that watching, and somewhere, hidden in the dark heart of the house, something stirred, hungry and patient.
The farmhouse no longer felt like a home. It had become a stage, and the Perrin family were unwilling actors in a play directed by something they could neither see nor understand. The whispering grew louder as winter deepened. At first, Caroline thought it was the wind. New England houses were famous for their drafts, and the long corridors of the farmhouse seemed perfect for carrying strange sounds. But then she realized the whispers were not random. They rose and fell like voices in conversation. Sometimes so close they seemed to be murmuring right behind her ear. The girls heard it too. Cindy, the middle child, began waking at night in terror, claiming she could hear many voices talking all at once from inside the walls. Christine, only 8 years old, was found sobbing one night, insisting that someone had been pulling her hair while she slept. The air inside the house took on a strange weight, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. Lamps flickered, shadows moved when no one was walking, and then came the smell. It always announced itself the same way, suddenly, sharply, cutting through the air like a knife. A stench of rotting meat, of damp earth, of something long dead. It would linger for a few moments and then vanish, leaving the family gagging and shaken. One afternoon, Caroline traced the smell to the cellar door. The basement had always been unsettling, a low, dirt-floored space filled with rusted tools and ancient stone walls, slick with moisture. Roger used it as a storage area, but Caroline refused to go down there alone. That day, she stood at the top of the steps, breathing in the sickly odor. For a moment, she thought she heard something below, a faint shuffling sound, as though someone were moving around in the darkness. She shut the door and locked it. Andrea saw her next. It was late at night, the house silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. Andrea had been reading by flashlight when she heard the sound of footsteps in the hall. She assumed it was one of her sisters and opened the door, only to find herself face to face with a woman standing at the end of the hallway. Her dress was old-fashioned, stained as though with dirt or blood. Her head hung at an impossible angle, her eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. Andrea froze, unable to move, as the figure slowly lifted an arm and pointed not at Andrea, but at Caroline's room, and then she was gone. It was as if the house had chosen Caroline. The bruises worsened, spreading across her body in dark, finger-shaped patterns. She became pale, her energy sapped, her mood erratic. Sometimes she would lapse into strange trances, staring into space for long minutes at a time, murmuring under her breath. The girls grew frightened of their mother. One evening, Nancy walked into the kitchen to find Caroline standing motionless by the window, whispering something too low to hear. When Nancy touched her arm, Caroline spun around so violently that the girls stumbled back, terrified by the look in her mother's eyes, cold, distant, almost not human. In desperation, Caroline reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the husband and wife, paranormal investigators who had gained a reputation in New England for their work on hauntings. When the Warrens arrived, Lorraine immediately felt the heaviness of the place. She later described the house as oppressively haunted, with multiple spirits moving through its rooms. "It's not just one ghost," Lorraine told Caroline quietly after walking through the house. "This place is like a crossroads. Something here is keeping them tied to this land." They decided to hold a séance in the living room to communicate with the spirits and attempt to find peace. That night, as snow fell softly outside, they gathered around a small table. Caroline and Roger, Lorraine, and a few trusted friends. Candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Lorraine closed her eyes and began to call out to whatever lingered in the house. At first, there was silence. Then the table trembled. Caroline gasped, clutching her chest. Her body went rigid, then convulsed, as though an invisible force had taken hold of her. Her chair scraped violently across the floor. Roger tried to reach for her, but Lorraine shouted for him to stay back. Caroline's head snapped backward, her mouth opening wide in a scream that did not sound like her own voice. The candles blew out all at once. In the dark, something moved. Andrea, who had been hiding on the stairs, later said she saw a shadow detach itself from the wall and hover behind her mother, whispering into her ear. When the lights came back on, Caroline was on the floor, sobbing, her face streaked with tears. Roger, furious and terrified, ordered the Warrens to leave, insisting that whatever they had done had only made things worse. But the damage had been done. From that night on, the haunting reached a fever pitch. Doors slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. The girls were yanked out of their beds by unseen hands. Caroline began speaking in a voice that was not her own, muttering about death, about sacrifice. Andrea woke one night to find her mother standing over her bed, a pair of rusty scissors clutched in her hand, her face blank. When Roger tried to intervene, Caroline hissed at him, a sound more animal than human. Lorraine returned secretly a few weeks later, unable to leave the family to face the darkness alone. She told Andrea what she believed, that the spirit tormenting them was Bathsheba, Sherman, a woman accused of witchcraft in the 1800s. Bathsheba cursed the land. Lorraine said softly, she offered her soul to something unholy, and now she will not rest until she drives every living thing from this place. Whether or not this was true, the idea took hold in the family's mind. Bathsheba became the name they whispered when things went wrong, when mirrors shattered on their own, when dishes flew off shelves, when Caroline's bruises deepened by spring. The house felt alive and hungry. Even on sunny days, the rooms were dim, the corners filled with shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. The children no longer played outside. They huddled together, terrified of what might happen if they left one another's sight. Sometimes, in the dead of night, they heard a sound like a rope creaking, slow, rhythmic, as if from an unseen noose swinging back and forth. Once, Nancy woke screaming, claiming she had seen a figure hanging from the rafters of her room, its body swaying gently in the stale air. The family was unraveling. Roger grew withdrawn, angry, drinking more than usual. Caroline seemed to fade, her skin taking on a greyish pallor, her once bright eyes hollow. The girls lived in a constant state of fear, their childhoods eaten away by something they could not name, and still the house waited for the moment when fear would ripen into despair, when its grip on them would be complete. Because whatever haunted the farmhouse was not merely a ghost, it was something older, something that fed on fear, growing stronger with each scream, each prayer unanswered, and it was far from finished with them.
The house was no longer just haunted, it had become a storm, a living vortex of fear and fury. Every step through its holes felt like wading through water. The air pressed down on their chests. Shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs, spun by something that had been waiting for centuries to be. Noticed it began on a windless night in late spring. The moon hung low, an amber coin peering through the thin clouds. Inside the farmhouse, the girls lay awake in their beds, unwilling to close their eyes. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the entire house seemed to shudder, a deep, resonant vibration that rattled picture frames and sent dust cascading from the rafters. April was the first to scream. When the others rushed into her room, they saw the corner where she had been leaving her toys. Every one of them was stacked into a strange, crooked pyramid, a shape that had not been there moments before. At the top of the pile sat a small, crude doll that none of the girls recognized. Its face was painted in a grotesque smile, its cloth body reeking of something sour. Then the knocking began. 3 sharp raps against the wall, slow and deliberate, as if from inside the plaster. Then, another set, from the ceiling above. Then, from the floorboards below their feet. It was everywhere, circling them, hunting. Caroline had stopped eating. She moved through the house like a sleepwalker, her hair tangled, her skin ashen. When she did speak, her voice carried a strange resonance, as if someone else was speaking through her. One afternoon, Andrea found her mother kneeling in the barn, clawing at the dirt floor with her bare hands. "Mom," she whispered, too afraid to get closer. Caroline turned her head slowly. Her eyes were black, not metaphorically, but truly black, the white swallowed by an inky darkness. "She wants blood," Caroline said in a voice that was not hers. "She wants me." Andrea ran. Roger, despite his anger, after the seance, finally called Ed and Lorraine back. When they arrived, Lorraine stood at the edge of the property for a long moment, staring at the house with her hand over her mouth. "It's stronger now," she said, "much stronger." They brought with them a priest, Father Gordon, to bless the house. But the moment the priest stepped inside, the candles blew out and the temperature plummeted. "Something doesn't want us here," he said grimly. That night, as the blessing began, the house erupted. A deafening crash echoed through the holes as a door upstairs slammed shut hard enough to splinter the frame. Dishes flew from the cupboards, shattering on the floor. The girls huddled together, screaming. Caroline was nowhere to be found. They found her in the basement, standing in the dark with her head tilted back, whispering in a guttural voice. The priest tried to approach, but she lashed out with a strength that was not her own, knocking him to the ground. "Bathsheba," Lorraine cried, her voice sharp. "Let her go." Caroline screamed, and the sound was so loud, so inhuman, that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. What followed could only be described as a battle. Father Gordon began to pray, his voice rising above the chaos. Lorraine stood beside him, clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ed shouted for Roger to hold Caroline down as she thrashed and snarled, spittle flying from her mouth. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into strobe-like flashes of light and shadow. Then silence. In that silence, Caroline spoke. "You can't have it," she said in a deep, guttural tone. "You can't have this house. It's mine." Her body convulsed violently, and for one horrifying moment, it seemed as though she would break her own bones. Then, with a final blood-curdling scream, she collapsed. When Roger lifted her head, her eyes were her own again. For a time, the house was quiet. The Warrens stayed for several hours, ensuring that Caroline was stable, that the girls could sleep. But when morning came, the house still felt heavy, as though holding its breath. Lorraine warned them that what had been done was not a permanent banishment. "This house has soaked up too much tragedy," she said softly. "What we did tonight may quiet it, but it will never truly be at peace." The family was never the same. Roger aged 10 years in a matter of months. Caroline moved through the days and a days, her laughter gone. The girls grew wary, jumpy, afraid of the dark, and yet they remained. Whether it was financial strain or some strange hold the house had on them, they stayed in that farmhouse for years. The activity lessened, became sporadic, but it never truly stopped. Sometimes at night, Andrea would still wake to the sound of the rope creaking in the attic, the faint smell of rot drifting down the stairs. By the time they finally moved out, the house had become part of them, a scar, a ghost that would follow them no matter where they went. Andrea would later write in her memoir that she often dreamed of the house calling her back, as though it were lonely without them, because that was the most frightening realization of all. The house was not just haunted, the house was alive, and it remembered them. The house did not release them easily, even as the parents packed their belongings and prepared to leave. The walls seemed to sigh, the floors to moan, as though protesting their departure. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. On the final morning, Caroline stood alone in the kitchen, her hand on the scarred wooden table. The house was silent, too silent, as though waiting for her to say goodbye. "You don't own me," she whispered, her voice shaking. A single knock echoed from the basement door. Life after the farmhouse should have been a return to normalcy. The parents moved into a smaller house, one with bright rooms and no history clinging to its walls. But normal was no longer possible. Andrea, the eldest, would sometimes wake in the night, certain she had heard footsteps in the hallway, though no one else was awake. Cindy complained of dreams where the woman with the broken neck stood by her bed, whispering her name. Caroline never spoke of the farmhouse. but sometimes she would drift off during family dinners, staring into the distance as though listening for something only she could hear. Roger buried himself in work, determined never to look back. But the past is not so easily buried. The house remained. Its windows watched the road like watchful eyes, its timbers groaning with age but never breaking. Locals avoided the property, muttering that strange lights could be seen in the windows at night, even when it stood empty. Some said they heard laughter, children's laughter drifting across the fields when the moon was high. Others claimed to see a woman walking along the stone wall, her head hanging at an unnatural angle, before vanishing into the trees. When new owners eventually moved in, they too reported strange occurrences: doors slamming, voices calling from empty rooms, objects moving of their own accord. It was as though the house had merely been sleeping, biding its time until someone new arrived to feed its hunger. Years later, Andrea returned to the farmhouse. By then she was a grown woman, her childhood behind her, but as she stepped onto the porch, she felt the same chill she had felt as a child. Inside, the house seemed smaller, quieter, but no less watchful. She walked from room to room, touching the walls, the windows, the places where her family's life had been shaped and scarred. When she reached the attic, she hesitated, her hand on the door. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing against her chest. She opened the door. The attic was empty except for a single object in the center of the floor. The crude doll April had seen so many years before, its painted smile still twisted and cruel. Andrea backed away slowly, her breath catching in her throat, and then she heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate from beneath the floorboards. Even after leaving the house that day, Andrea could not shake the feeling that something had followed her. She would catch glimpses of movement in mirrors, hear faint knocks in hotel rooms where she stayed, wake in the night with the smell of rot in her nostrils. It was not constant, but it was enough to remind her that the door between worlds had been opened long ago, and it had never been fully shut. Lorraine Warren would later speak publicly about the case, but she always did so with caution. There are places where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner, she said in one interview. The Paranormal is one of those places. It is not just haunted, it is a portal. Things come and go. Some of them never leave. Her words only deepened the legend, drawing thrill seekers and investigators to the farmhouse in the decades that followed. Some left with nothing but stories, others left shaken, pale, refusing to speak of what they had seen. Today, the Conjuring House stands as it always has, silent, waiting, its windows reflecting the sky. Visitors come from around the world, daring to spend a night within its walls. Some laugh off the stories, leaving with nothing but a souvenir photo. Others leave convinced that something in the house touched them, whispered to them, marked them. And sometimes, when the night is still, those who sleep there say they are awakened by a sound. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. As if the house is reminding them that they are not alone. On her final visit, Andrea stood at the edge of the property, looking back one last time. The house seemed almost peaceful in the fading light, its weathered boards glowing gold in the setting sun. But as she turned to go, she heard a soft creak behind her like a rope tightening. She did not look back. Some doors, once opened, are better left closed. Long after the visitors have gone, after the moon has risen and the fields are quiet, the farmhouse exhales. Its timbers shift with the cool night air. Somewhere in the darkness, a shadow moves from one room to another, tracing the path it has walked for centuries. It pauses at the kitchen table, where a woman once whispered that the house did not own her. And in the silence, the house smiles, because it knows sooner or later, someone always comes back. This ending leaves the story unresolved, chilling and open to interpretation. The house itself remains an active presence, a living character that continues its work long after the parents are gone.